Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Hello from a very dark, wet and cold London. It's our pleasure to have Dr. Raphael Marcus, who's joining us from Manhattan, New York. And what we'll do over the next hour is we're going to go through some of Raphael's findings in his study on the criminal backgrounds of ISIS recruits in America. So first we'll have Raphael present for about 20 minutes or so. Got a few initial questions myself that I'm very keen to ask, but then really want to get the audience involved. So if you have any questions in mind, feel free to just type them in the Q&A and we'll eventually go through all of them. So it is my pleasure to welcome you, Raphael, Dr. Raphael Marcus, who got his PhD from King's College London, just down the corridor, no less. He's now working as an intelligence research specialist at the New York Police Department's Intelligence Bureau, and he's the author of a wide-ranging study that looked at the criminal backgrounds of ISIS recruits in America. So without further ado, Raphael, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thanks so much, Rajan. Nice to speak to ICSR and speak to King's, albeit virtually. I'm sure it would be much more preferable to be there in person, but this is it's the name of the game nowadays. I wanted to sort of discuss my study, which I undertook while I'm employed at the NYPD Intelligence Bureau, that looked at sort of what we call the crime-terrorism nexus, basically the interplay and overlap between crime, criminal history, criminal networks, and terrorism. I should just mention this is all done in my personal capacity. You know, the usual disclaimer doesn't represent the official position of the NYPD. But I was sort of given the opportunity to conduct, while at the NYPD, an independent research study that would be practitioner related, but also in a sense academically rigorous. And what is it in law enforcement, in a law enforcement agency, that we have more than anybody else, and that is criminal data. We are sitting on a mountain of data. And I think with a real eye-opener for us about what we can do and what we can learn was looking at the European context for this intersection between crime and terrorism. We saw, you know, the perpetrators of the Bataclan attacks, getting fake IDs from the criminal underworld, you know, the Charlie Hebdo, Ahmed Koulibaly, selling drugs and using the proceeds to get weapons, and the getaway car, the Kouachi brothers involved in the selling of knockoff clothing, and then using the proceeds to sort of fund their attack. And this was a lot of the great work that was outlined in the ICSR reports over the last 5 or 6 years. And I think what jumped out at us as well in the UK context was the Manchester bomber and these very concrete ties to British Libyan gangs in South Manchester, and how members of the gang potentially facilitated the attack, helped procure materials, especially regarding the getaway car, and over and over we saw the same story in Europe, which was that the dreaded words that the perpetrator of the attack or the arrestee was known to law enforcement prior to the incident. And this is sort of it's a horrible term that to think about, that there was information out there that law enforcement had, but very often it was only in the criminal domain. So this sort of made me scratch my head and want to examine what does that crime-terrorism nexus look like in the United States? Because in Europe, it appears, in a sense, quite pronounced. And Rajan and Peter Newman, did a lot of great work on the matter. And I think to sort of conceptualize how we understood the crime-terrorism nexus, it's really four-pronged. Number one, do the perpetrators of ISIS attacks or those arrested, which I call defendants, arrested on terrorism offenses in the U.S., do they have a criminal background, a criminal history? And if so, what kinds of crimes were they involved in? Violent crimes, etc. Number two was the utility of crime for the funding logistics of a plot. And again, we saw in Europe how the criminal underworld and gangs facilitated the recruitment and radicalization of members, helped procure material. Do we have that in the United States? What's the utility of crime? And number 3 and 4 are the role played by both gangs and prisons for radicalization and recruitment, for plot relevant relationships and so forth. And I think learning from ICSR's work, we saw that in Europe, all four of these questions were very much, we see in Europe very concrete examples as such. Khaled Zarqani in Belgium, involving a gang of pickpocketers to raise funds to send guys to Syria, and so forth. So what I did was basically look at each and every ISIS arrest in the United States federally, which totals exactly 200 individuals who I'm referring to as ISIS defendants, who are arrested on terrorism offenses or when there's a specific allegation of a connection to ISIS. Of course, everything is from public court records, and when the allegation to ISIS has been specifically made by the Department of Justice, by the federal government. Most terrorism cases go federal in the United States, opposed to on the state level. So these are only federal cases and excludes juveniles, and of course excludes cases that aren't publicly revealed. It also includes the 10 perpetrators of attacks who are deceased in the United States, totaling 210. And first things first, we looked at the criminal history of these 210 individuals. And right off the bat, interestingly, about a third of ISIS defendants had a criminal background. Now, this is a little bit less than the findings that Rajan and others in Europe, came to, about 50 to 60% in the Netherlands, 50% in Belgium or France, maybe a little bit lower in the UK. In the US, it's 32% to be precise. But when you really dig down into the nature of the criminality, of the prior criminal history, is there sort of are there any diagnostic indicators for law enforcement? Is there anything in the criminal background of these individuals who end up going on to perpetrate terrorism offenses, looking for clues, diagnostic, typological, and right away, very interestingly, the prevalence of violent crime. And of course, we see this in Europe as well, but about 2/3 of those with prior arrests were for violent offenses, most specifically for domestic violence, assault, and firearms offenses. Of course, our problem with firearms in the United States differs dramatically from the UK context and much of Europe. But by and large, of this 1/3 who had a criminal past, domestic violence, prior arrests, and prior experience or prior arrests for firearms offenses, firearms trafficking, menacing with a firearm, etc. So that was 2/3 violent offenses, which correlates overall to all ISIS arrests. About 21% of all ISIS defendants in the United States have a violent criminal past. So to me, this is an interesting finding with some significance. Also, not only are these people arrested once for a prior offense, I looked at repeat offenses and recidivism. And by and large, those are the criminal past. It was not a one-time thing. There were several arrests, and something along the lines of, I won't bog you down with statistics, but about 35% had more than 3 arrests. And the average, some of them was 6 arrests, 11 arrests, 12 arrests. And it really drives home that known to law enforcement slogan. And repeated arrests for law enforcement, in a sense, provide a snapshot in time of where an individual stands. And sometimes, based on law enforcement interactions in the criminal domain, there are some indicators that we can pick up on that are of relevance. And the average number of arrests is, like I said, is 3 per defendant of those with a criminal past. So again, these guys get arrested a lot before they end up going down, radicalizing and going down that road towards eventually, terrorism. And what's so interesting, in a sense, is that this is a less pronounced a phenomenon than Europe. There's no doubt about it. However, there still are some important takeaways from the U.S. data set. When we look, just to sort of zoom out for a moment, of the 210 defendants, by and large, the demographic, it's white, young, and U.S.-born males. About 89% male, a third convert, with the average age of 27. So we have a very young. It's a young population, and this, in a sense, animates part of the criminal background. So we, by and large, have the violent history, and I think what's important to highlight in the criminological research, which I think scholars and students of terrorism, we sometimes neglect. It's been a lot of work on, on criminal violence and recidivism in the strictly criminological domain. So violent history has been proven, in lots of criminological research as a good predictor for future criminality. Basically, those with a prior violent offense are more likely than others to carry out a violent offense in the future. And then to take it a step farther, there's been studies that have even suggested that those criminal offenders with a violent past are more likely to engage in violent extremism than somebody without a violent past. And I think what's important for us is that violent offenders will likely have a shorter flash to bang period. And what I mean by that is, a shorter period between radicalization to mobilization to violence, because as was highlighted in ICSR's reports earlier on, if you're attuned to violence, you have a violent history, you have a history of firearms, that jump, so to speak, to mobilization is much shorter. That gap is much shorter. And I think that's a big takeaway of why criminal history is important. Now, just to highlight some interesting examples of domestic violence, about a third of those with a criminal past had a history of domestic violence. And just for example, Ahmed Rahami, who was the so-called Chelsea bomber in 2016, set off several explosive devices in New York City and New Jersey. Thankfully, didn't kill anybody because he put the bomb inside a dumpster rather than just being on the pavement. But in any event, prior to his radicalization, he had 2 arrests for domestic violence, but one of them around the same time that his father actually had notified law enforcement about his concerns about his son being potentially radicalized. Rahami had just come back from Pakistan. The father raises the alarm with law enforcement. There's a domestic incident when Rahami stabs a cousin and there's a big altercation. And this sort of, it's a little prosaic to say, but outbursts or behavior, including violent behavior, that result in an exclusion or rejection by family and community are both, in a sense, long-term indicators of concern. And this is, been highlighted by some of the national counterterrorism organizations in the United States. So this is why sort of domestic violence, family, friends, significant partner is important. Very often the nature of the domestic violence can actually give you a window or a snapshot into the ideological disposition and occasionally, very occasionally, future intentions. For example, there's a very bizarre case that took place in New Jersey. A guy named Gregory Lepsky, family calls in to local police in a small seaside town in New Jersey that Lepsky is trying to kill the family dog because he is, quote unquote, he thinks the dog is impure, and according to his version of Islam. Police come to the house and they see a dog with a stab wound, and they go into the house. And when they enter the house, they find a pressure cooker, they find jihadi material, and sort of precursors to an explosive device. And Lepsky basically admits to wanting to carry out an attack. He wants to go to Syria. I mean, I think it also highlights mental health concerns, but the initial patrol response of the sort of frontline police officer to domestic violence results in this massive counterterrorism investigation. Now, that's a very extreme example, but sort of highlights how the nature of the domestic violence incident can sometimes hit home. There's another case in upstate New York, a guy named Arafat Nagi, a Yemeni American, who threatens to behead his daughter at a supermarket for staying out late. He brandishes a military-style knife. And then, of course, a year later, somebody in the community sounds the alarm that this guy, Arafat Nagi, is fighting with other community members about the merits of traveling overseas and the merits of ISIS. And I mean, if you take into the context that he threatened to behead his own daughter, again, these are the most extreme examples, but there are clues and indicators in some of these prior domestic violence. There was another one, there was a cluster of Bosnians who were supporting a foreign fighter in Syria in upstate New York. And this guy, prior to eventually sending money to his friend who was a foreign fighter, had a domestic incident with his wife. She was wearing perfume, which contained alcohol, and this caused a big domestic incident where he hit his wife and daughter. Police are called. But when you go back and you look at this initial incident, it gives you a snapshot into the road that these guys may eventually go down. Of course, just because you have a domestic past or a violent criminal history doesn't mean that you are predestined to radicalize. All I'm suggesting is that there is utility in examining the criminal past of some of these characters. The second big trend was the prevalence of firearms offenses. Now, of course, we know in the US, we have a very big problem with guns. They are all over the place and it's legal. And basically 20% of those with a criminal past had prior arrests for firearms offenses. You even have ISIS proclaiming, exploit the lax gun laws in the United States to procure a firearm. There's a famous jihadi video in 2017. Go out, take advantage of the fact you could get them so easily. So if 20% of guys who eventually go on the road to commit a terrorist offense have a firearms history, that's to me, that's quite concerning. But what's interesting is that about 23% of those with a criminal past are eventually charged with a firearms offense as part of the terrorism prosecution, which suggests that prior familiarity or a prior arrest for firearms offenses actually appears to influence the attack weapon choice. And in a sense, if you want to even go into the subset of those specifically with a firearms history, 77% of those with a history of firearms offenses are charged with a firearms offense as part of their terrorism prosecution. So 3/4 of those with a history of firearms offenses end up getting arrested for a firearms offense as part of their terrorism plot. So to me, that really shows that familiarity with firearms, prior arrests for firearms, something to keep track of. I know over here, especially in the UK, thankfully, we don't have the same problem. In the US, there's actually something, as a felon, committing a major crime or a violent crime, you're prohibited from owning a firearm. There's actually a specific federal charge for the possession of a firearm as a felon, which is prohibited. And it turns out that about 20% of those with a criminal past are ultimately charged with possession of a firearm as a felon. So it's a charge that's very specific to the United States, but has a lot of utility for law enforcement, and also highlights how that history of firearms offenses or a felony history, can in a sense work to an advantage to law enforcement, because these guys are looking for guns, and if they buy a gun, then they're in trouble. And ultimately, those with a criminal past are about twice as likely to be charged with a firearms offense as part of their terrorism prosecution compared to those with no history, which is which is quite interesting. There's a very interesting case in Tampa. There's a guy, Azhari. He, in a sense, he was inspired by Omar Mateen, the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooter. But this guy has a prior firearms offense, Azhari, for brings a gun into a department store. He has a firearms offense. He eventually radicalizes. He starts surveilling targets in Tampa, Florida, and the nightclubs. When eventually he attempts to procure a firearm for use in his attack, and he's arrested for firearm as a felon, they find a boatload of ISIS propaganda and all his plans on his computer. And that just sort of shows you the utility of the firearm as a felon charge. And there's many other instances. There was another guy in Virginia, Somali American named Yusuf Waheli, was involved in cigarette trafficking. And they eventually, he tries to buy a gun, and with a criminal past, and it worked. He was ultimately arrested. As for plot relevant criminality, we know in Europe, the criminal activity, in a sense, provided financial support for attacks, whether it was pickpocketing, drug sales, etc. But in the United States, regarding logistics or financial financing of a terrorist plot, we had about 15 cases when we could concretely tie criminal activity to a plot, which is only about 7% of all plots. So it's a very different phenomenon. And in a sense, much like the title of Rajan's formal report, in Europe, it appears that those, given 50–60% of criminal past, criminals are acting as terrorists. And in the United States, of course, this is oversimplification, but terrorists basically attempt to act as criminals, because most plot relevant criminality is actually perpetrated by those without a criminal history, which is very different than the European, what we see in Europe. By and large, the crime that we see the most in support of an attack is financial fraud. And this is to raise money for the attack, to support the travel of a fighter overseas, to get money to buy a getaway car, to buy a firearm, etc. But what's so interesting is that those who carry out the financial fraud were not the ones who have a history of financial crimes in their past, which is very different than Europe, where we're seeing those with a criminal history, in a sense, use their old criminal skills to further, to further a terrorist plot. And there's some very interesting and innovative ways that these guys use financial fraud. The only problem is that these are not the ones who had a history of financial fraud, which in a sense highlights the challenge for law enforcement, that you don't have those indicators and that history for those who are involved in the criminal activity. You had guys carrying out credit card scams. There's a well-known case on Long Island her name was Zubia Shanaz, Pakistani American female, 27 years old. She carried out lots of credit card fraud, opening up various accounts. She builds up credit. She invests in cryptocurrency, which she then sends over to various ISIS shell companies. But she was involved in all sorts of credit card fraud. And of course, she had no criminal history. We also had lots of guys without any criminal history using their federal student aid, which is sort of like tuition assistance in the United States, to buy plane tickets, bus tickets for friends. And they used, various debit and bank fraud in that respect. And there was a whole cluster of Somali Americans from Minnesota who funded their travel, or attempted travel, I should say, to Syria from Minnesota via New York via the use of federal student aid fraud. But the problem is that while we do have fraud being used to logistically or financially support a plot, we also have totally legal means of fundraising. Within that same cluster, just for example, of Somali Americans from Minnesota, one of the kids involved was received a big payout for an accident where a bridge actually collapsed on his school bus as a kid. So he was receiving money from the government because of this accident. Very, very strange story. And then he used that accident money to basically help a whole bunch of his mates go over to attempt to go over to Syria. And this is, of course, totally legal. He was getting this money as part of this settlement with the collapsed bridge. And this sort of highlights this big problem, this big challenge about legal and legal means of fundraising and financial fraud. And then there's other more sort of bombastic cases where there was an individual named Amr Hagagai in California. He attempted to do credit card fraud and identity theft to procure poison-laced drugs or cocaine to distribute in San Francisco to sort of poison people, and especially in sort of the gay community. And ultimately, he was convicted of terrorism offenses as well as this identity theft case, which he carried out identity theft to hide his identity as part of this whole plot, as far-fetched as it sounds. So again, we are seeing crime utilized in furtherance of plots, but again, not to the same extent as in Europe. And it appears that most of these guys, given how, in a way amateurish some of this stuff is, are radicalized individuals utilizing criminality, instead of in Europe, where you have hardened criminals, moving down towards terrorism. But we do have examples that sort of resonate, like in the US, that sound a lot more similar to the European context. There's a great case study, big case in San Diego, two brothers named Marcello McCain and his brother, I can't remember at the moment, but basically they fund the travel of a whole network of North Americans, Canadians and Americans, to go to Syria. It's funded by a jewelry store robbery committed by a friend of theirs in Canada named Abdullahi was their friend who used to live with them in San Diego. He moves to Edmonton, Canada, carries out a jewelry store robbery. And this money from this jewelry store heist is used to fund a whole network of guys going over to Syria. The brother's name was Douglas McCain. He was actually one of the first, if not the first, American foreign fighter to die in 2014 fighting for ISIS. So here you had two guys, the McCain brothers, with a violent criminal history, procuring guns in the United States, going to the range, shooting range beforehand. Douglas goes to Syria using this money from a jewelry store robbery, and eventually is killed out there. And Abdullahi in Canada is extradited to the United States. And Marcello McCain is arrested for the firearm as a felon, given that he had a violent criminal past. So this sort of highlights how a lot of this criminality intersects. And this, to me, looks a lot like, one of those, large networks in Europe that we saw in 2015, 2016. So we have it, but not to the same scale and scope, I would say. Regarding gangs and extremists, in a sense, in Europe, gangs, there's a lot of, the same recruitment pool, similar underlying characteristics, group dynamics, engagement patterns. As Rajan's prior study highlights. In the US, what's so interesting is that we do have guys who have a prior gang affiliation who do radicalize. But what's so important to highlight is that very often they withdraw from the gang once they radicalize. When in Europe, especially places like Belgium and France, the gang in a sense acts as the incubator. In the US, they withdraw from the gang. And while there are in a sense similar group dynamics and mechanisms at play between gangs and extremists in the United States, they don't often share the same recruitment pool, and again, most importantly, they withdraw from the gang. There's an interesting case study in Somalia. It was a great study, in fact, of human traffickers from the Somali American community and extremists. And again, there's a lot of similar push and pull factors for why you get involved with a human trafficking gang, and similar to why people get involved in extremism. But there was very little organizational overlap, and that was something that we saw in Europe time and time again. This overlap where criminal actors are procuring materials and helping push the plot along, and we're not seeing that to the same extent in the U.S. Just one great case study to highlight in Chicago. There's a gang, and this again looks a lot like Khaled Zerkani in Belgium. There's a very big-time drug dealer and gang member in Chicago named Jason Brown. He's arrested, typical gang member stuff, guns, drugs, and while he's in prison, he has access to a phone and he radicalizes by Sheikh Faisal, Abdullah Faisal, who has a long history in the UK before he was eventually arrested and extradited to New York. And what Jason Brown did once he got out of prison was he basically radicalized all his fellow gang members who were involved in drug dealing. They all had to convert, and as part of his quote unquote personal jihad to sort of radicalize his fellow gang members, he was encouraging them to go to Syria, and he himself was eventually arrested for sending money to someone he thought was a member of ISIS. And this is an intriguing outlier in a sense. This is the overt how the gang in a sense was facilitating the recruitment and radicalization of all these guys. But again, to me, it's an outlier. And then as for prisons, and we can get into the weeds on all of these various issues, just to sort of to close it out. Prisons, as we know, especially in Europe in light of recent terrible attacks, act as radicalization, recruitment of new members. You can learn new skills, new relationships, plot relevant relationships inside prison. But when you really examine the US data set, only about 13% of all ISIS defendants serve time in prison, as little as 3 days to as many as 7 years. That was sort of the date range. Overall, though, of those who served in prison, almost 20% radicalized there, which is higher than I thought. However, it's a very small number. It's only about 7 defendants. 5 radicalized in prison and 2 were the radicalizers. And I think when you dig down into each one of those case studies, it was very clear in each case that exposure to a non-isolated, charismatic, or high-profile terrorism inmate already in the system was pivotal in all 7 cases. And this sort of charismatic inmate already on the inside who was not isolated acted in it sometimes as the spiritual sanctioner or helped with the training. But even though 18% of those who served in prison radicalized there, it's still very rare in the U.S. system. And I'll tell one interesting case study with a New York context, and then we can sort of go into the Q&A. But there's a case of a guy, Albanian American named Sajmir Ali Mehmeti. He's involved in an Albanian gang in the Bronx in New York City. Gets arrested, for stealing someoe's phone. He beats somebody up. He goes into prison, and while he's in prison on this assault charge, they stick him next to a guy named Mohammed Mamadou, who was already imprisoned for trying to blow up a Manhattan synagogue in 2011 as part of a Al-Qaeda inspired plot. But while Sajmir, who was just this Albanian gang member, is locked up, he befriends Mamadou and in a sense radicalizes. When Sajmir eventually gets out for this assault charge, he's only in for a few months. He goes back to visit Mamadou upstate when Mamadou is transferred to another prison upstate. And 4 days before Sajmir eventually tries to go to Syria, he goes to visit Mamadou, and they're photographed together, making the finger pointing gesture. What's so interesting, so Sajmir is arrested eventually for trying to travel, and when Sajmir is then put in prison, he's put in the same prison as Ahmed Rahami, the Chelsea bomber, who I previously discussed, who had those domestic incidents. Rahami, this is already 2016, 2017. He's carried out his failed explosions. And then Rahami, in the US, the prisoners have access to various court documents on the inside. They get to review them. He was allowed to view jihadist propaganda that was being used against him in court, basically unsupervised in prison. He shares all these materials with Sajmir, who's on the inside with him, and they start radicalizing other people in this prison. And it's eventually discovered. They discover Rahami has the phone numbers and addresses of other inmates in the U.S. correctional facility who are involved in terrorism offenses, including a big Al-Qaeda arrestee from several years prior, a guy who was arrested for Al-Shabaab ties. So it sort of just shows you that the unsupervised high-profile inmates is a big problem, as well as sticking guys who, at the time in 2011, Sajmir was just a gang member. You toss him in next to a guy who's already locked up for terrorism offenses. It sends us down this road. It turns out to be a big problem. So that's sort of, and lastly, prison, it occasionally solidifies plot-relevant relationships. Plotting does often continue inside prison, which is what we see in Europe as well. But very interestingly, in the US, most prison plots are actually busted and reported by other inmates who are often angling for cooperation, which I think sort of speaks to having the importance of having eyes and ears inside a prison system. But most of these plots where these guys are arrested for terrorism offenses and are put in prison continue to plot and attempt to procure weapons or put a hit out on the undercover informant or officer who got them arrested in the first place. These plots are generally thwarted by other inmates angling for cooperation. So I think I tried to highlight in broad strokes sort of the crime-terrorism nexus in the US, which is observable with and there's a lot of interesting cases to discuss, but in a sense, it's less pronounced than Europe, which makes me wonder if there's lots of differences socioculturally and sociologically between the US and the UK, which we can definitely discuss. But the thing that jumped out at me over and over again was this overrepresentation of sort of broken homes, mental health, drug and alcohol issues, pointing to perhaps other prominent issues of more prominence related to their personal, social, psychological background. So criminal history is important, as well as utility of crime, gangs, and prisons, but it's really only one piece of the puzzle, at least in the US, well, I think in Europe as well, but especially in the US context. So I know I just, I gave a lot of information in a short amount of time, and I welcome any way you wanna move it along, Rajan.
Yeah, super. Thank you, Raphael. I mean, one thing immediately jumped out to me was the role of prisons, or rather the lack of the role of prisons when it comes to radicalization and the ISIS jihadi scene in America. So the first question that I had was, well, does that mean that they're doing everything right? I mean, why is there the absence of prison in the jihadi scene?
I mean, I don't think we have an absence. And I think, over the last 20 years, there's been congressional committees, and there's a lot of, in a sense, fear-mongering over the risk of radicalization in US prisons. The United States incarcerates, unfortunately, a lot of people. There's millions of people locked up in the 50 states. So it does happen, but by and large, it's a very rare phenomenon. And I think even though it's hard to sort of really wrap your head around this, US prisons are generally, they are relatively well maintained. There's a lot of corrections officers. And I think, one of the issues you highlight in your study is that badly run prisons, overcrowded prisons, poorly supervised prisons are like that fodder for radicalization. And in the US, there is a relative order in the US prison system. And I also think we generally isolate terrorism inmates from the general population. I know there's a lot of discussion in Europe how to play that, but by and large, especially if it's a high-profile terrorism offense, it's very often solitary confinement in Florence, Colorado, in Supermax.
So, on that note, Raphael, we've got a question from Tara in the chat. She goes, are there facilities within the US that specifically isolate terrorism convicted prisoners from quote unquote ordinary prisoners? And if so, would you say this is effective in the US setting? Or if this is a technique that was introduced, are they at a greater risk of radicalization from one another within prison due to an essential life echo chamber?
Right. I mean, this in a sense echoes the debates that the UK has been having over the last 10 years, and many countries in Europe are grappling for the most effective way to deal with incarcerated terrorists. And in the US, despite skepticism by critics, generally do tend to isolate terrorism prisoners in federal prisons. And I think, in all 7 cases, I know it's a small data set. Well, it's 210. It's all we have. It's every ISIS case. Of all 7 that I could find with prison radicalization, it was always a high-profile terrorism inmate who was not isolated, who was allowed to mingle with others. There's a great case of a guy in Texas. This guy named Muhammad Ibrahim Ahmed was actually a old school Al-Qaeda guy. He went to Al-Qaeda training camp in 1996. He goes to Somalia, trains with Al-Shabaab. He's eventually extradited from Nigeria back to the United States. And he's put in prison in Texas. And this guy, with those kinds of jihadist credentials, having been to an AQ camp in 96, was basically allowed to mingle with a whole bunch of guys inside this federal prison in Texas. And they train together in the prison yard, and they work out together, and he procures materials for them, and he encourages them to become a sleeper cell. And there was several other examples where these high-profile inmates are not isolated. I'm not an expert in the prison system, but that's the way that we generally do in the United States.
And was there an indication then of those 7 that radicalized? How did they interact with the existing prison gangs or the prison hierarchy? Were they ostracized? Were they trying to mingle? Were they accepted? What was the situation?
Very often these high-profile terrorism inmates, in a sense, act as like a charismatic personality, charismatic figure within the prison system. Of course, within the U.S. prison system, which is, gang life is rampant inside the prison. And if you want to really take it to another level, the nationwide, the sort of racially and ethnically motivated, white supremacy gangs are rampant in the U.S. prison system. So, a future excellent study would look at how the interactions between gangs and sort of far right-wing terrorism would interact. But I digress, I'm sorry. But these guys usually act as sort of charismatic inmates within the system, where they're able to, provide protection. A lot of people, not just extremists, but people convert for protection inside prison, convert for benefits. So it's not necessarily unique to the ISIS data set. A lot of the push and pull factors that draw people in, it's not necessarily unique to Islamic extremism. It's the same with right-wing extremism. Same sort of push and pull factors that draw people in.
Yeah, so this is something I was curious about, because America has a much more developed gang culture within the prison environment, right? White supremacist groups, other groups as well. And so I also wondered if the lack of prison radicalization was because people are just radicalizing into other groups and other ideologies and not the jihadi one.
Well, I think if you want to zoom out from the 1/3 who have a criminal past, more than 50% have no criminal history and therefore have no prison time, which speaks to sort of other factors that send people down this trajectory of radicalization besides the prison experience, which I think in a sense ties in with some of the issues I mentioned towards the end of the presentation regarding mental health issues and broken homes and drug and substance abuse. So I think prison can have an impact, but if you think about that, more than 50% so far and counting of federal ISIS arrests never served in prison, it sort of speaks to other factors that can influence somebody to go down this road.
Sure. So Raphael, just got one question on the prison front, and then we can move to a different topic. This is from one attendee who's asking, is there a rough or general time period that's necessary for a radicalizer in jail, in prison, to influence another inmate?
By and large, when these guys with only criminal backgrounds are put in a state facility or a federal facility alongside somebody who's there on extremism for terrorism offenses, they're not there for very long. You know, I know that the length of prison's term of the ISIS defendants was about anywhere from 3 days to 7 years. More of them were on the lower end of the spectrum, you know, several months instead of years. And I think, you know, prison is a relatively inhospitable place. And I think a lot of these guys, out of loneliness and sense of belonging, gravitate to somebody charismatic who can provide protection. And again, that's not necessarily unique to the ISIS experience. There wasn't no concrete time frame that I can give you, though I think it's certainly it's not 7 years, it's more like several months.
And just moving on then to the types of crimes that these 210 defendants had committed. What really stuck out to me was the prevalence of domestic violence in their histories. And this is something I think that researchers and policymakers are kind of switching onto a little bit more. And I'll share something that's come out in the UK. There was this project, Project Starlight, that looked at the domestic violence incidents of individuals referred to Prevent. Prevent is this PVE initiative across the UK.
Sure.
And the figures for that show that of 3,000 referrals in 2019, of the adults, 40% had a history of domestic violence. And that was either as perpetrators or as victims and witnesses. And in some cases, it would be all three. So to me, that really stuck out because I never heard of such a high rate of domestic violence. And this is really good data set of 3,000 referrals over 1 calendar year. The details will be made public in the future. It's Joan Smith who's written about this. So I wonder, why do you think this prevalence seems to be so high? What could the consequences of that be?
It's a great question. And I think Europe, much like the United States, the data is not that far off. You know, I think what I found was of those with a criminal past, there was something 30-something% were for domestic violence, usually as a perpetrator, but also sometimes as a victim. And you know, just a side note, domestic violence in the United States, but I'm sure globally, is often underreported because of all the various sensitivities that go around that. So I think the number is probably much higher than just 30%. And it's often, you know, they don't follow through on prosecution, charges are dropped because this is the person that you're often living with. But it's a very good question. I mean, I think domestic violence really has to do with how interpersonal relationships and you know, violent outbursts, aggressive outbursts, which is why it's important for counterterrorism practitioners to sort of look very closely at those of the domestic violence past. I mean, I know the Westminster and London Bridge perpetrators in the UK both had domestic violence history. I think even the Nice truck also. So this is something that you see over and over again. And I think it all has to do with that, I guess, impulse control, you know, and the propensity for violence.
Sure.
And who do you lash out at the most, but those closest to you generally, which is why I think the National Counterterrorism Center in the US puts such importance on that, you know, the outbursts of violence towards family or community, which result in that sort of you know, isolation from your family community is such an important, you know, mobilization indicator. But it's a good question.
So we've had that here in the UK with the case you mentioned, Westminster Attack. This is in March 2017 with this man called Khalid Massoud. He drove a car across the bridge and went out and he stabbed a police officer at the House of Parliament. And when people looked into his criminal background, it turned out he was a very violent individual. And with instances of domestic violence, a lot of interpersonal conflict, stabbings, assaults, very lucky to get off an attempted murder charge one time. And one consequence of that was that the presence of a violent past was given much greater prominence when assessing someone's propensity to actually act on their terrorist beliefs. And so this is something that also stuck out in the examples that you gave. So you mentioned the Levski case, you mentioned Arafat Nagy, where it's almost like the authorities just by chance, by good fortune, rumbled a terrorism case by going to domestic violence incident. So that's kind of by fortune. And I wonder if the authorities have kind of changed things by design so that, similar to the Westminster case, they put greater prominence to certain aspects of not just domestic violence, but just general violent behavior in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the importance of looking at criminal history. And I think one of the sort of policy recommendations, if you like, is that law enforcement should really be engaging with organizations, non-governmental organizations that help assist victims of domestic violence, or organizations that really deal with domestic violence day in and day out within the communities, that they can flag instances of sort of special concern, not necessarily for counterterrorism police, just make sure that there's actually adequate follow-up. And there are domestic violence units and lots of slowly but surely more robust sort of police initiatives regarding victims of domestic violence, where locations are flagged to police as known locations for DV and stuff like that. Because I think not only is it an indicator, but there's also obviously the opportunity for constructive intervention, ideally, which is instead, I guess, a whole other side of the story. Yeah.
Okay. So the majority of the sample, the 210 defendants you looked at, they're men. So one question we've had in the Q&A is, well, what about the involvement of women? What role do they play here? And the question from Christina goes, are women more involved in such actions when their significant other is also involved in terrorism cases?
So I know ICSR, including friends and colleagues from my time at King's, did a lot of great work on women and violent extremism, women in ISIS, and I'm not downplaying or minimizing the role that women play in ISIS at all. The way that it turns out in the United States, by and large, it's a male-dominated data set. Regarding the specifics of a significant other, I think we see very often dyads or triads, the jargon used of couples, boyfriends, girlfriends, brothers, siblings, etc., getting involved in this. So I think San Bernardino is the famous one of husband and wife who shot up a California, the job location of one of them. But the husband, a lot of debate of whether the husband influenced the wife or that she was actually the one. And this happens every time there's a husband-wife couple. I mean, women have traveled overseas, plenty to go to Syria, but very often those are not publicly revealed. There's no standing court case if they're killed out there. There's no indictment, etc. But I'm not downplaying at all the role of women. I mean, I know in the UK it's a common discussion, common thread about the role and influence of couples, and lots of interesting examples of when the wife tries to stop the husband, other times where the wife encourages the husband. There's one case that just popped out in New York, and again, I'm only speaking from what's in the newspaper, where a guy tries to travel to Syria with his wife, and he wants to go via ship from New Jersey to go to Yemen via cargo ship. Talk about a long journey, but that's when husband and wife are tag teaming it together. Lots of cases like that as well.
It's interesting because in Europe we've seen a handful of cases where women involved in jihadism online have assumed the persona of men. So they've taken up a male kunya and they've tried to recruit other people using that. And I think that's really interesting sort of phenomenon to see, of women co-opting the gender roles, wanting to appear really masculine online. We've seen this with the case of Ines Madani in France. She tried to blow up the Notre Dame Cathedral. We saw this in the case of Sophia Sheikh. She also blew up a cathedral here in London, St. Paul's. Online, they acted with these male personas. I thought that was quite a novel thing, but it hasn't really been examined, how prevalent that is amongst women or the exact rationales for it. But it's an interesting thing nonetheless.
Yeah, that's a really interesting phenomenon. In the US, to be honest, again, speaking broadly, generally women, I think, tend to sort of really relish their role as sort of a female in this whole thing. At least, you know, we haven't seen in the cases, the ISIS cases, where women are impersonating males. Very often, as the female, you know, there's a lot of the looking for a husband overseas and sending money to a male suitor, you know, in Syria, stuff like that, with that sort of romantic flavor. So we haven't actually seen what you described in Europe, though I'm sure that we will.
Yeah, okay. So just going to the Q&A, we've got a few questions here, I suppose related to the role of women and couples. Question from Laura, which is, what about the role of siblings and family more generally? Often there are cases of brothers, like the Boston Marathon attackers, radicalizing, even if they come from a non-radical family, so their parents may not be radical. What are your thoughts on this one?
I mean, I think family can go either way. So the case of the McCain brothers, which I described, where one brother goes off to fight in Syria, just before that he goes, the brothers are going to the shooting range together. The other guy, you know, Marcello, wants to follow his brother to Syria. But you also have instances of a family turning in sons or daughters, or brothers turning in other brothers, you know, or wives telling on husbands. So I really think it can go either way. I know in Europe there's been some pretty high profiles. You know, just comes to mind that the Manchester bomber and the role that his brothers had, the role that his father had. Yeah. These are recurring themes, and I really think there's no hard and fast rule as to the role of family. It can either be an enabler, or it can be, in a sense, very often the people who sound the alarm bell.
Yeah, just on that note, we're going through an inquiry about the Manchester Arena attack, and if anyone's been following it online, it's they post videos on YouTube of the daily sessions. It's amazing the material that's come out, and it's emerged that Salman Abedi was essentially part of a gang environment in Libya. And it's curious because they brought several of his friends who were close to Salman to give a testimony at the inquiry, and they've all been very keen to distance themselves from Salman, but it's very apparent that he himself was involved in this gang environment, and many of his friends were stealing drugs and so on. But at some point, he seems to have stepped away from that lifestyle himself. But curiously, his own brother, Hashim Abedi, he was routinely still smoking cannabis and taking drugs, even in the build-up to preparing the bomb and the attack. So you see a kind of difference between brothers there. Salman, who distanced himself from a lot of that criminal behavior, whereas his brother, who was convicted for his role in planning the attack, continued to engage to a large degree.
Yeah, no, I think certainly there's definitely the answer, as usual, rather than black and white. I think it's always shades of gray. But just following what's going on in Manchester is absolutely fascinating, and to me sort of struck home the importance of really looking at the crime terrorism nexus, because I believe one of his gang member associates is also potentially being charged for safeguarding the car, or wiping down the car, hiding evidence. Really illustrates how the gang and I think was tasked to safeguard the car, and the role that the gang played.
Yeah, so this is one of the issues that has popped up during the inquiries, to what extent his friends actually knew about the attack, or whether Salman was just kind of stringing them along or using them without knowing what the final purpose was. So this is something that kind of, we'll have to see what the final inquiry report says. But on the issue of the crime terror nexus, it's interesting because in one of the witnesses from the security service from MI5, they said that they discounted a few strands of intelligence because they considered that it had a non-extremist purpose. It was just regular criminal activity.
Right.
Haven't exactly disclosed what those strands were. So speculation, maybe when he was purchasing the chemicals, maybe they thought it was for something else, maybe for hydroponics, or he was going to, grow some drugs, or it was for the stash car that he was using to store the explosives. That's often used by regular criminals to store drugs and so on. Right. So it's possible they could have misconstrued something there.
Yeah, just that example I described in Chicago of Jason Brown, who was this gang member who was again radicalized by Sheikh Faisal in prison on a gang charge, and then radicalizes and converts all his gang members. They were involved in like the mass distribution of marijuana and fentanyl, and actually sort of like a postscript to Jason Brown's arrest for terrorism offenses is that everybody in the gang was arrested, or like 11 guys were arrested on narcotics charges, federal narcotics charges, sale and distribution interstate. So I don't know the answer to this question, but I wonder if the narcotics charge was a convenient way to get guys who were potentially radicalized off the streets, or it was, or Jason Brown was not successful at radicalizing his other gang members. I don't know the answer, but I think that there's more to the story there.
Okay, so on that note, we've got a question from one attendee who's asking, is there reticence within some criminal gangs to distance themselves from suspected terrorists in order to avoid the law enforcement heat and investigation of themselves by association? And as a secondary question, are there any crimes that ISIS will not be involved with? And they've given the example of prostitution, but do you see other types of crimes where ISIS defendants actively disengaged from and rejected?
So there's many examples in Europe. It doesn't really seem that they had many qualms about engaging in drugs and sale of drugs or prostitution or people trafficking in Europe. I'm not necessarily sure that their morality kicks in when it comes to criminal activity and amongst the kuffar, amongst in Europe, amongst the infidels. I think in the United States, which was obviously the focal point of the report, what really struck me was in a sense, very often the lack of that sort of coherent criminal network. It was very often 1, 2, 3 people tops attempting to sort of muddle their way through some sort of financial scam or criminality, or 1 or 2 cases trying to procure firearms in the black market or fake IDs, etc. But I think the real the difference is that in Europe, to me, it seems much more, especially in the France and Belgium cases, criminal networks, and in the US it's much more often a lone actor. I think that has a lot to do with it, but I don't think that these guys have any qualms about engaging in various types of criminal behavior, because of the way that they can justify their activities in the hated list.
Have you seen any cases where there's been that active justification of crime for the purpose of jihad? No, it's been often mentioned in jihadist propaganda, in Ramia magazine and so on. They told their recruits to do that. In Europe, we've seen several examples of this, but this is something that's absent in America or not?
I think, as you highlight, Ramia and Inspire, there's no shortage of, carry out criminal activity. I even think in one of the most recent jihadi publications, they encouraged the abuse of the COVID loan program in the United States in order to carry out attacks. Maybe that was Voice of Hind or whatever it was. But yeah, actually, can you repeat I actually lost my train of thought. What was the question?
Yeah, no problem. So have you seen that encouragement of crime as a form of jihad, using that justification that you're in the lands of Dar al-Harb, of lands of war with the kuffar, or is this something that hasn't really been utilized amongst the jihadis in America?
No, I think for sure for some of the financial fraud, there's no problem to defraud the system and steal from the system that you hate and despise, and that you're ready to pack your bags and go over to Syria. There's no reason. We've seen this for years. Taking out loans under fraudulent pretense to not pay them back. We have the same stuff that Europe has when it comes to that. Building up credit and insurance scams and all that to justify getting your money to then go over to Syria. The same story.
Okay, and just one final question from an attendee who's followed up on your comment that in contrast to the European picture, you're seeing terrorists who sometimes engage in crime, while European suspects are criminals who sometimes engage in terrorism. So the question is, does this suggest that radicalization in the US is more ideologically driven or not?
I think the group dynamics and the small network dynamics in Europe play a very important role in radicalization and mobilization to violence. Doesn't mean you don't have lone actors in Europe. I think it's pretty obvious that you do. But just if you look at all 210 US cases, it's lone actor, radicalization, very often online propaganda, very few in-person connections. It's all in the online space. I think is a big difference than the European landscape, especially on the continent. I know that not as much in the UK,
Yeah,
but especially on
Raphael, could I just interrupt there is this because of law enforcement techniques and the prevalent use of role players? And we have role players here in the UK and across Europe, but seems to be much more widespread in the US.
When you say role player, do you mean an undercover?
Exactly, someone online. So that means that before they then connect with people in real life, they're kind of running into these undercover operatives online, and then they're going through the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think, though, of course, perhaps I'm biased, that it's a less permissive environment in the United States for a whole host of reasons. And I would love to debate and talk about this over a pint with anybody, but I tend to think that it's a less permissive environment. So these guys are often pushed away from in-person contacts and big group meetings into the online space. And as many of these cases, 210 guys or 200 arrests, many of them were ultimately arrested and prosecuted because of the work of an undercover. And this is very obvious just from what's out in the open, speaking by the court documents, where the undercover turned out to be the one to help facilitate travel, or they went to an undercover to ask for help to buy a gun. And this is often, a key linchpin in helping secure the prosecution. And I know it's used in Europe as well, pervasively, but yeah, no, it's interesting, interesting line of thinking.
Super. So I know we've gone just a couple minutes over, but I do want to ask one final question. So after doing this study, what else is on the horizon for you? What are you going to be publishing next or looking into next?
So, you ask somebody if they want to continue to publish on the thing that they just published on, and that's the farthest thing from their mind. But I mean, I think for future researchers and anybody who wants to masochistically go through 210 individual court records to figure out what a criminal past is, I think there's a lot of work to be done in the white supremacy space regarding the crime terrorism nexus. As I mentioned before, the white supremacy gangs, criminal gangs, as well as prison gangs, is rampant in the United States. And in a sense, the white supremacy scene here resembles, like those networks of white supremacists, resembles in a sense, 2015, 2016 Belgium and France. And I think there's all those kinds of great studies that ICSR did on the sort of France, Belgium, crime terrorism nexus. I wonder how that would look with some of the, skinhead motorcycle gangs in the Southwest involved in drug trafficking, and how that facilitates recruitment and ties to other white supremacist gangs and chapters and racially, ethnically motivated violent extremists. That's certainly a possibility.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that would be fascinating to read. And so I'd encourage anyone who's listening in, if you're thinking of doing further research here, that would be a very good topic to look at. Yeah. So I'll draw this to a close now and encourage anyone who wants to read this further. You could check out the full report. It's available free online at the Center on National Security at Fordham Law. The title is ISIS and the Crime Terror Nexus in America, Counterpoint to Europe. But if we're all in person, we'll give you a rousing ovation now. But I want to thank you, Raphael, for joining us and sharing your thoughts and your research on ISIS in America.
Thank you very much. And just to say, if you don't want to read a 70-page study, there's about a 20-page adaptation of the study and studies in conflict and terrorism. So I could save you reading 45 pages if you'd like.
Perfect. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. And thank you, Raphael, once again.
Thanks for having me.